Between 1952 and 1961, patients at the Weyburn Mental Hospital received a drug in the course of their treatment that they were never told the name of. When documentation was presented to them before a session, and documentation was not always presented, the drug was described as a new medicine to help with your condition. Some patients were told nothing at all before the session began. They were taken to a room, given an injection or a tablet, and observed. Over 700 patients received LSD at Weyburn in this way. Not one of them was told it was LSD. Not one was given, in any form that would satisfy the consent standards developing in international medical ethics at precisely this moment. A meaningful choice about whether to participate. The research was funded by the Saskatchewan provincial government and the Federal Department of National Health and Welfare. It was conducted by credentialed psychiatrists at a publicly operated institution. It was published in peer-reviewed journals. It was cited approvingly by the Canadian Mental Health Association. It was done to people who had come to a hospital for help. This was the Weyburn Mental Hospital, built by a province that believed, sincerely, progressively, with genuine reforming intent, that it was building the most humane psychiatric institution in Canada. It became, instead, a place where the line between treatment and experiment was erased so gradually, so procedurally, so quietly, that no one with authority was ever required to acknowledge the erasure. If the histories embedded in progressive institutions, the ones that are hardest to look at, because the intentions were real, are the kind you want to keep uncovering, you're welcome to subscribe and come with me. To understand what happened at Weyburn, you have to understand the political atmosphere of Saskatchewan in the 1940s, because the institution's experimental program did not grow out of indifference. It grew, paradoxically, out of ambition, out of a province that believed it was building something better. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation came to power in Saskatchewan in 1944 under Tommy Douglas, a Baptist minister from Weyburn itself, who had run on a platform of social democratic reform so comprehensive that it represented, in the context of post-war North American politics, something genuinely radical. Public insurance, public utilities, the expansion of the welfare state into corners of provincial life that private enterprise had left empty. Douglas had grown up watching poverty in the Depression. He had a specific fury about inadequate healthcare. He had plans. Mental health was among them. Saskatchewan's psychiatric institutions in 1944 were, by the standards of even the era, indefensible, overcrowded, understaffed, funded at levels that reflected the province's pre-war indifference to the people inside them, rather than any assessment of what care required. Douglas knew what he had inherited. He had visited the institutions. He had seen the wards. The political context he created, a government explicitly committed to public health reform, publicly willing to spend on institutions that previous governments had starved, publicly proud of its progressive credentials on social welfare, was the soil in which the LSD program would eventually grow. The program was not a secret operation conducted against the government's wishes. It was funded by the government. It was the government's research. Its ambition was the government's ambition. That is what makes it difficult to look at directly. The harm was not the product of hostility. It was the product of certainty. The certainty of a reforming government that its institutions were doing something better, and that therefore the work being done inside them needed less scrutiny than the work inside institutions that were not trying to do something better. Certainty in an institution with no external accountability is its own kind of blindness. Robert Story was the first superintendent appointed to run the Weyburn Hospital for the Insane when it opened its doors in 1921. He was a physician of the era, trained in the custodial tradition of institutional psychiatry, which held that the primary function of an asylum was the safe containment of people whose conditions made them dangerous to themselves or others. And that treatment, in any meaningful sense, was a secondary consideration, if it was a consideration at all. The building he was given was enormous. Weyburn Mental Hospital was designed to hold 1,000 patients. By the time Robert Story had been replaced and his replacement had been replaced, the population had swollen to over 2,000. The wards built for 40 held 80. The corridors built for circulation held instead patients who had nowhere else to be, standing or sitting or moving in the particular repetitive patterns that long-term institutional life imposes on a body that has run out of other options. The town of Weyburn sat in the southeastern corner of Saskatchewan, where the Souris River bends through the plain and the sky opens in all directions with a flatness that is either liberating or oppressive, depending on your circumstances. For the patients inside the hospital, the sky was largely theoretical. The grounds were accessible to some of them in supervised periods, but the surrounding prairie was not a landscape that invited escape. There was nowhere to escape to. The nearest city was Regina, 100 miles north. The hospital sat at the logical end of a long road that most people arrived on and did not leave by choice. The wards filled with men and women who had been sent from farms and small towns across a province that had no other infrastructure for the people its communities could not manage. The definition of who qualified for institutionalization was expansive and consistent with the era. Schizophrenia, chronic alcoholism, epilepsy, what the admission records called constitutional psychopathy, what they called moral insanity. Diagnoses that described conditions and conditions that described inconveniences, and inconveniences that described the specific failure modes of people whose lives had produced more than they could hold. Some of them were genuinely, severely ill. Some of them were not. The distinction was not always the governing factor in admission. The man who would change this institution arrived from England in 1951. He had not been asked to run the hospital. He had been asked to do something more specific and more dangerous, to answer a question that psychiatry did not yet know how to ask. The building that stood at Weyburn from 1921 to 2009 was designed in the collegiate Gothic tradition. Red brick with limestone trim, Tudor arches over the main entrance, a central administrative tower that rose above the flat prairie skyline and was visible on a clear day from 12 miles in any direction. The architect, Maurice Sharon, had designed public buildings across the prairie provinces and understood what public buildings were required to communicate: permanence, authority, the specific grammar of a structure that the community has decided to take seriously. The main entrance opened into an administrative hall of deliberate dignity, terrazzo floors, wainscoted walls, the superintendent's office directly ahead with its broad oak desk and its window looking south across the hospital grounds toward the Souris River Valley. The building communicated, at the administrative level, that serious work was being done here by serious people who had been trusted with serious responsibilities. Behind the administrative hall, the wards began. The patient wards stretched east and west from the central block in two long wings, each ward a corridor of institutional routine. Linoleum floors, high ceilings, windows fitted with wire-reinforced glass, set just high enough that a patient of average height could see the sky, but not the ground. The sleeping rooms were dormitory style in most wards, rows of iron frame beds in rooms designed for a specific number of patients, housing, in practice, a third more. The occupational therapy suite occupied the ground floor of the east wing, a series of connected rooms with large windows and workbenches, designed in the reforming spirit of the 1920s idea that structured activity was therapeutic. The woodshop, the sewing room, the weaving looms. These rooms were genuinely used, genuinely valued by staff, and, in many cases, genuinely appreciated by patients. They were also, in the practical economics of an under-resourced institution, the rooms whose output contributed directly to the hospital's operational functions. The furniture repaired in the woodshop stayed in the hospital. The linen sewn in the sewing room dressed the hospital's beds. At the end of the East Wing corridor, past the occupational therapy suite and past the nurses' station, a door opened into a room that the hospital's internal documentation described as the clinical observation suite. It was smaller than the wards, a single room, perhaps 14 feet by 12, with a single chair and a single cot and walls painted the particular institutional green that mid-century public buildings adopted as a compromise between the clinical white of a surgical theater and the institutional gray of a holding cell. Institutional green said, "This is a medical environment." It said, "You are being cared for." It said nothing about what the care would consist of. Set high in the observation room's door was a pane of wire-reinforced glass, 6 inches by 8, the kind found throughout the hospital, in doors that connected spaces where staff needed to monitor patients without entering. From the corridor, looking through that pane, you could see the chair, the cot, the room's single light fixture, whatever was inside. the room did not have a handle on the inside of the door. It would, in the years after 1952, become the room where patients came after receiving an injection and stayed until the effects resolved. 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, while staff sat on the corridor side of the window and took notes. The building could not have known what it was being prepared for. Buildings do not know things, but the room was ready. Before the experiments, Weyburn operated as what a reforming government in the 1940s recognized as a crisis. A building holding twice the population it was designed for, staffed at a ratio that made individual patient attention a theoretical aspiration rather than a practical reality, administering care whose primary instruments were restraint, sedation, and the structured routine of institutional life. The nurses and attendants who worked the wards were not, in the main, indifferent people. They were people working in impossible staffing conditions, with inadequate resources in a building that had been overcrowded before the Depression and had not recovered from it. The documentation they produced, the ward notes, the shift reports, the annual assessments, describes patients with the compressed language of overwhelm. Stable, non-disruptive, no change, requires continued supervision. These are the phrases of a system that has given up on the difference between maintenance and healing. Patients in Weyburn's long-stay wards in the 1940s worked the hospital farm. They maintained the hospital grounds. They staffed the laundry and the kitchen in the same institutional arrangement that other Canadian provincial hospitals used. Patient labor, documented as occupational therapy, generating the operational outputs that made the institution's budget work. The farm produced food, the patients produced the farm. In 1946, the newly elected Douglas government commissioned a review of Saskatchewan's psychiatric institutions. The review was conducted by Dr. D. Griffith McCarracker, later joined by federal health officials, and produced a report that described Weyburn and the Saskatchewan Hospital at North Battleford in terms that the Douglas government accepted as confirmation of what it already knew. These were not therapeutic institutions. They were custodial facilities, operating at the boundary of humane standards, and they needed to be transformed. The government announced a comprehensive mental health reform agenda. New staffing, new programming, new research investment. Saskatchewan would not merely repair its psychiatric system. It would reimagine it. That reimagining attracted, from across the Atlantic, a man whose ambitions were precisely as large as the government's, and whose methods would eventually outrun the ethical framework that anyone in Regina had thought to build. In the winter of 1951, the patients of Weyburn Mental Hospital received a new superintendent and a new research director simultaneously. He arrived as one man holding both titles. Dr. Humphry Osmond was 31 years old. He had trained at Guy's Hospital in London, served as a Royal Navy surgeon during the war, and spent his post-war years at St. George's Hospital in London pursuing what he considered the central, unsolved question in psychiatry, the biological basis of psychosis. What, he wanted to know, was happening in the schizophrenic brain. And could a substance that produced psychosis-like states in a healthy person provide a window into the experience of someone whose psychosis was involuntary? His credentials were genuine. His publication record, at 31, was already notable. The Saskatchewan government had recruited him specifically because it wanted researchers who would ask large questions about psychiatric illness. And Osmond was, by any measure available to the province's recruiters, a man who was going to ask large questions. He had already, by the time he arrived in Weyburn, ingested mescaline himself, an experiment in self-administered psychedelia that was, in the culture of early 1950s psychiatric research, considered a respectable method for developing empathy with patients experiencing altered states. The mescaline session had convinced him that the experience of certain psychedelic substances was closely analogous to certain features of schizophrenic experience. If he could understand the biochemistry of the one, he believed, he might begin to understand the biochemistry of the other. He had written about this to a writer in England named Aldous Huxley, who was profoundly interested in the philosophical and spiritual dimensions of altered consciousness for reasons that were his own. Osmond and Huxley had been corresponding. In 1953, Osmond administered mescaline to Huxley in person in California, a session that Huxley would describe in The Doors of Perception, the book that would, within a decade, make the psychedelic experience a cultural phenomenon far beyond the walls of any Saskatchewan hospital. But that was still ahead. In 1951, Osmond arrived at Weyburn with a hypothesis, a government mandate to research, and a building full of patients who had no knowledge that any of this was coming. He believed he was going to help them. He believed this with the specific force of a man who has never been told he is wrong by anyone with authority to say so. The funding that enabled the Weyburn research program came from two sources, whose combined absence of oversight was the condition that made everything else possible. The Saskatchewan Department of Public Health provided direct provincial appropriations for research at Weyburn from 1952 onward. The amounts were modest in the early years, a few $1,000s for supplies and equipment, and grew as the program produced publications that enhanced the province's reputation in international psychiatric research. A government that was proud of its progressive credentials had additional incentive to fund research that confirmed it was doing progressive things. The documentation trail between the Saskatchewan Cabinet and the Weyburn research budget runs through a series of annual appropriations whose line items describe the work in terms of psychiatric research and treatment development, without specifying that the treatment being developed was being administered to people who had not been told what it was. The Federal Department of National Health and Welfare provided grant funding beginning in 1953, under the health research appropriations that the federal government was expanding across the post-war period. Federal grants to Weyburn were approved by a committee that reviewed research proposals against the standards of the era, standards that were, in 1953, in the early stages of grappling with what the Nuremberg Doctors' Trial of 1946 had produced as its defining ethical legacy, the Nuremberg Code, which established voluntary consent as the absolute prerequisite for any medical experiment on human subjects. The federal committee that approved the Weyburn grants did not investigate how the consent procedures described in the research proposals would be implemented with a population of institutionalized psychiatric patients. Institutionalized patients occupied a specific and uncomfortable position in the consent frameworks developing from Nuremberg. They were, by definition, under the authority of the institution that would be administering the experiment. Their consent, obtained by the institution whose care they depended on, and whose authority they could not realistically refuse, was consent whose voluntary character was structurally compromised before anyone had put a tablet in anyone's hand. No ethics board existed at Weyburn. No ethics board existed at any Canadian hospital in the early 1950s. The concept was developing in the international literature, but had not been formalized into any institutional requirement in Canada. The oversight gap was not a deliberate design. It was simply the state of affairs, a research program operating in the space between a Nuremberg Code whose principles were known and a regulatory infrastructure that did not yet exist to enforce them. In that space, between 1952 and 1961, the federal government provided the Weyburn research program with approximately $200,000. The Saskatchewan government provided a comparable sum. The patients who received the drugs paid for the research with the only resource they had, their bodies and their experience. They received no acknowledgement of this contribution. They received no share of the grants. The experimental session at Weyburn began the same way each time, and the sameness was itself a feature of the protocol. A patient selected for participation, selected by clinical staff on the basis of diagnostic category, rather than personal willingness, since no mechanism existed for determining personal willingness in a population whose institutional dependence made free refusal nearly impossible, was brought to the clinical observation room in the East Wing. They were given either an oral dose or an intramuscular injection. The oral doses ranged from 75 to 200 micrograms of D-lysergic acid diethylamide. The intramuscular doses produced faster onset and were used when researchers wanted more precise timing for observation purposes. A staff member, or in some sessions Osmond himself, sat in the corridor outside the observation room with a notepad. Through the small window in the door, they recorded what they saw: the patient's movements, their vocalizations, their visible emotional states. The notes from these sessions survive in the Weyburn Research Archives and have been examined by historians at the University of Saskatchewan. They describe, in the compressed clinical language of mid-century psychiatric observation, what it looks like when a person in an unfamiliar room, with no explanation and no choice, has their consciousness fundamentally altered. The psychotomimetic hypothesis, the theory that LSD produced a model psychosis that could illuminate the biological mechanisms of schizophrenia, was the primary research frame for the early sessions. Osmond and Humphry, who joined the program as biochemical research director in 1952, developed what they called the adrenochrome hypothesis, the theory that schizophrenia was caused by the accumulation of a toxic metabolite of adrenaline in the brain, and that LSD produced its effects through a similar biochemical mechanism. If true, this would represent the first biochemical theory of a major psychiatric disorder. The hypothesis was ambitious. It was published in peer-reviewed journals. It was discussed at international conferences. It attracted research interest from psychiatrists in England, the United States, and continental Europe. It was not supported by the evidence that subsequently accumulated. The adrenochrome hypothesis was not confirmed by later researchers who attempted to replicate its findings, but in the early 1950s, before the replication attempts, it was the most prominent biochemical theory of schizophrenia in the field. And it was being tested, every session, in the observation room at Weyburn, on patients who had no idea what was being tested or why. The alcoholism research arm of the program began in 1954, when Osmond and Humphry proposed that a single large dose of LSD, producing a sufficiently overwhelming experience, might break the psychological pattern of alcohol dependence in ways that conventional treatment had failed to achieve. This hypothesis had a different character from the psychotomimetic work. It was not trying to model a disease. It was trying to treat one. Patients admitted to Weyburn for alcoholism were given single high doses, sometimes 300 micrograms or more, in a carefully staged setting designed to maximize the experience's psychological intensity. One attendant, whose testimony was collected by a Saskatchewan oral history project in the 1990s, described what the alcoholism sessions looked like from his position in the corridor. A man in the room crying, then laughing, then lying very still for what seemed like a long time, then sitting up and trying to explain something that the attendant could not quite follow through the glass. The attendant said that he had never known what the man had been given. He had been told it was an experimental treatment. He had written down what he saw. He had not been told what he was writing down for. He had been watching. The man on the other side of the window had not been told anyone was watching. Some patients were given LSD multiple times across their hospitalizations, not as a single experimental intervention, but as a recurring component of their institutional treatment, documented in their charts as experimental therapy, with session notes attached. Some patients, in the records that historians have been able to examine, show 6, 8, 10 separate sessions across multi-year admissions. The chart entries for these sessions are distinguishable from entries about other treatments by a particular quality of clinical detachment, the language of observation, recording observation, without the language of individual response that clinical notes about recognized treatments tend to carry. The clinical record describes what was done. It does not record whether the patient was frightened. It does not record whether they understood what was happening. It does not record whether, in the hours or days after a session, they asked anyone what had been put into their body. Some of them did ask. Some of those who asked were told it was a vitamin. Some were told nothing. Some of those patients had names and lives that preceded everything that happened to them inside that building. The names come next. Numbers, even numbers like 700, can become institutional. So let us remember 3 names. Margaret Clark was 34 years old in the autumn of 1955 when she drove herself to Weyburn Mental Hospital from Moose Jaw and checked herself in for depression. She was a farmer's wife with 3 children, the youngest 18 months, the oldest 9, and she had not been able to get out of bed with any reliability since the youngest was born. Her husband drove her the first time to see her family doctor, who referred her to a specialist in Regina, who referred her to Weyburn as the institution with the most advanced treatment program in the province. Before admission, her file notes describe her as oriented to time and place, cooperative, articulate in describing her symptoms, and showing signs of moderate depression without psychotic features. She could read. She read to her children. She had been on the executive of the Moose Jaw Women's Institute. She was assigned to a ward. Within 3 weeks of admission, she was selected for inclusion in the psychotomimetic research program on the basis of her admission diagnosis. She was brought to the observation room. She was given a tablet and told it was a new medicine to help with her condition. What followed, in the session notes, is described as acute anxiety with dissociative features. Margaret Clark was terrified during the session. She did not know why the room was changing. She did not know what was happening to her body or her perceptions. She asked, repeatedly, whether she was dying. The session notes record this question 3 times in the 4-hour observation window. The notes do not record what she was told in response. After the session, Margaret Clark was transferred to the closed ward. She remained there for 6 weeks. Her discharge notes from that period describe her as symptomatically worse than at admission, with increased anxiety and sleep disturbance. Her depression had not improved. The session, the unasked-for experiment, had given her, in addition to everything she had arrived with, a terror of medical procedures that she carried for the rest of her life. She was discharged 7 months after admission. She returned to Moose Jaw, to the farm, to the 3 children. Her husband's family, in the way that communities in that era managed what they could not discuss, did not ask her about her hospitalization. She did not tell them. She told no one for 37 years. In 1992, when the first survivor accounts began appearing in the Saskatchewan press, Margaret Clark read them and recognized what had been done to her. She spent the following 2 years trying to obtain her file from the provincial archives. Her file confirmed the session. It did not contain a consent document, because there was no consent document to contain. She filed a complaint with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Saskatchewan in 1994. She was told that both physicians principally responsible for the research program, one of whom had left Saskatchewan decades earlier, one of whom was retired, and were not subject to the specific complaint mechanisms applicable to current practitioners. The college expressed its regret for her experience. It did not open an investigation. Margaret Clark died in 2007. She received no apology from the province, no apology from the hospital, no apology from any physician. Her complaint, filed in 1994, is in the college's records. It is marked closed. Gordon Amos was 47 years old in the spring of 1957 when his wife drove him to Weyburn and signed the admission forms. He was a grain farmer from a section farm 18 miles outside Weyburn itself, and he had been drinking heavily since the previous harvest. Not the drinking of a man who enjoys alcohol, but the drinking of a man who has discovered that it is the only thing that stops a sound in his head that he cannot name and cannot explain. His admission diagnosis was alcoholism with depressive features. He was assigned to the alcoholism research arm of the program. He was given a high-dose LSD session. The records show 350 micrograms, orally administered, in the stage setting that the alcoholism protocol specified. A room with flowers and art reproductions, and a record player, designed to make the overwhelming experience beautiful rather than terrifying, in the theory that the beauty would be therapeutic. Gordon Amos did not find it beautiful. The session notes describe extreme agitation in the 3rd hour, resolved into a prolonged period of lying still. His post-session interview, conducted the following day, is recorded in the file as patient reports profound and disturbing experience, expresses willingness to abstain from alcohol. This was coded as a positive outcome. It was the outcome the protocol was looking for. He was discharged after 12 days with a clean prognosis and a referral to a provincial outpatient clinic that had a 6-month waiting list. He did not return to the farm the same man who had left it. His wife said, years later, to the oral historian who found her, that Gordon had come back from Weyburn afraid of things he couldn't name, afraid of the dark in ways he hadn't been before, afraid of being alone in a field, afraid of his own thoughts in the particular way that a man who has had his sense of reality fundamentally altered and never understood what altered it, remains afraid of it happening again. He stopped being able to drive the combine at harvest time. He didn't explain why. He just stopped. The farm ran on a second mortgage for 2 years and was sold in 1960. Gordon Amos lived in Weyburn Town for the rest of his life, working occasional labor, drinking in the way people drink, when something they cannot name is still making the sound. He never knew what had been put into his body in the spring of 1957. The clinical note from his discharge described his treatment as standard protocol for the alcoholism program. The word LSD did not appear in the discharge document. He died in 1981. The provincial archives released portions of his file to his daughter in 2003, after she made a formal access to information request. The session record was there. The 350 micrograms were in it. The consent form was not. Helen Rusk was 22 years old when she was admitted to Weyburn in 1959. Referred by a psychiatrist in Saskatchewan who had diagnosed her with schizophrenia on the basis of 3 clinical interviews. She was a clerk at a Saskatoon department store. She had a brother in Regina and parents in Swift Current and a rented room on Avenue B where she kept a plant on the windowsill and read science fiction novels on her days off. She was admitted to the research ward and received LSD 4 times across her 18-month hospitalization. The first session was 7 weeks after admission. The last was 3 months before her discharge. The sessions are documented in the clinical record: dosage, duration, observer notes. No consent document appears in her file for any of the 4 sessions. After discharge, Helen Rusk returned to Saskatoon. She did not return to the department store. She worked, intermittently, in various clerical positions for the next decade. She was functional. She was not whole in the way she had been whole before admission, and she could not always identify what specifically had changed, which is one of the specific cruelties of what was done to her. The damage did not have a name she could point at. In 1975, she read an article in a Saskatoon newspaper about LSD research at Weyburn and recognized, for the first time, the name of the drug that had been administered to her 16 years earlier. She spent the next 15 years requesting her own medical records from the provincial archives. She was repeatedly informed that the records were held by the institution, and then, after the institution closed, that the records were being processed, and that access would be available in due course. She received her file in 1991. She was 54 years old. She sat at the table in the provincial archives, reading room in Regina, and read her own clinical record for the first time. The session notes, the dosage records, the observer annotations, describing her experience from the corridor side of a window she had not known anyone was watching through. She said, to the archivist who had helped her locate the file, and who was the only other person in the room, "They were watching me the whole time. They just didn't tell me." She did not file a formal complaint. She said, when asked why, that she did not believe anything would happen. She was not wrong. These 3 represent hundreds more. People who had no way of knowing that the injection or the tablet they received had a name, a published research protocol, and a federal grant number attached to it. People who experienced what they experienced and returned to their lives carrying something they could not explain because they did not know what had been done to them. People who have since died without having their experience officially acknowledged, without having their file confirmed to them, without having heard from any government or physician or institution the 3 words that the record would support, and that were never spoken. They deserve those words. The record supports them. No one with authority has spoken them. In 1963, a researcher within the Federal Department of National Health and Welfare prepared an internal review of ongoing grant-funded psychiatric research in Canadian institutions, with specific attention to experimental protocols involving psychoactive substances. The review identified Weyburn as a program in which the consent procedures documented in research proposals were not consistent with the consent standards the Nuremberg Code required, standards that had, by 1963, been incorporated into the World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki, adopted the previous year as the binding international framework for research ethics. The review was not published. It was distributed internally. It was not forwarded to the Saskatchewan Department of Public Health, which continued to provide provincial funding. It was not shared with the Weyburn Institution, which continued to conduct sessions. It was not provided to the Canadian Medical Association or to any professional regulatory body that might have been positioned to act on it. The federal funding continued for 2 more years, until 1965. The suppressed 1963 review came to light not through a government disclosure or a journalistic investigation, but through a Freedom of Information request filed in 1998 by a researcher at the University of Saskatchewan who was assembling the documentary record of the Weyburn experiments. The Department of Health, by then reorganized as Health Canada, produced a partially redacted version of the document. The passages describing the consent findings were intact. The names of the officials who received the review and chose not to act on it were not among the redactions. Those names are in the document. What is absent is any record, in the files surrounding the review, of those officials making a decision. The decision not to act produced no memorandum. It produced only a continuation of the funding. In 1961, the Canadian Mental Health Association published a report praising the Weyburn Research Program as a model of progressive institutional psychiatry. The report cited the LSD alcoholism research specifically as a promising development in the treatment of a condition that had resisted conventional approaches. The report did not describe the consent procedures used in the research. The CMHA had not asked about the consent procedures. The endorsement was genuine. It was also, in the light of the 1963 review that was 2 years away when the endorsement was written, a piece of institutional praise attached to a research program that a federal reviewer would shortly find ethically compromised. Both of those things were true simultaneously. No one has ever been required to account for their coexistence. Dr. Humphry Osmond left Weyburn in 1961 to take a position at the New Jersey Neuropsychiatric Institute. He had spent 10 years in Saskatchewan and had produced, in those 10 years, a body of published research that had made him internationally known. He had coined the word psychedelic from the Greek words for mind and to make visible in a letter to Aldous Huxley in 1956. He had introduced LSD to a cultural conversation that would, by the mid-1960s, be far larger than anything he had imagined from the observation room corridor in Weyburn. He was never investigated by any professional body. No licensing authority reviewed his Weyburn consent practices. No government commission examined the specific question of what it meant to administer LSD to a population of institutionalized psychiatric patients in the context of a research program they had not meaningfully agreed to join. His career continued, productively, until his death in 2004. Dr. Abram Hoffer continued research at the University of Saskatchewan after Osmond's departure. He pursued the orthomolecular psychiatry framework, vitamin-based treatments for psychiatric disorder, for the remainder of his career, a body of work that remains controversial in the clinical literature and that has its advocates and its critics. He received honors from the orthomolecular medicine community. He was never investigated for his role in the Weyburn consent failures. He died in 2009. In 1987, the Saskatchewan government commissioned a review of conditions in provincial psychiatric institutions, a broad review prompted by deinstitutionalization concerns, rather than the specific question of research ethics. The review documented conditions at multiple institutions across the history of the provincial psychiatric system. It noted the Weyburn LSD research in a single paragraph, describing it as an example of research practices that reflected the standards of its era. It did not recommend any investigation. It did not identify any survivors or recommend any acknowledgement process. No survivor of the Weyburn experiments has ever received a formal apology from the province of Saskatchewan or from the federal government of Canada. The research was funded by both. The acknowledgement owed by both remains outstanding. The research framework that enabled Weyburn's LSD program did not retire when the session stopped. It has a longer history and a wider geography than any single institution. The Nuremberg Code, formulated in 1947 from the evidence of what Nazi physicians had done to concentration camp prisoners, established 10 principles for ethical research on human subjects. The first principle, that voluntary consent is absolutely essential, was not a new idea. It was a restatement, with the force of international law behind it, of what the history of medical experimentation had repeatedly demonstrated was necessary. The question the code addressed was not whether researchers knew that consent was required. It was whether any institutional structure existed to ensure that the knowing translated into practice. At Weyburn, the answer was no, and Weyburn was not alone. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, which ran from 1953 to 1973, administered LSD to subjects in the United States who had not consented to receive it, including patients in psychiatric institutions, prisoners in federal penitentiaries, and, in the program's most notorious episode, a CIA operative named Frank Olson, who was dosed without his knowledge in November 1953, experienced a severe psychological crisis and fell to his death from a New York hotel window 9 days later. MK-Ultra was not a Canadian program. It operated in parallel with the Weyburn research during the same years, under the same absence of ethics infrastructure. The two programs shared a cultural assumption that certain categories of people institutionalized patients, prisoners, specific research populations, could be used in ways that would not be acceptable if applied to anyone with the social standing to object. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1962 formalized the consent requirement in international research ethics and began the process, slow, incomplete, still ongoing, of building the institutional infrastructure to enforce it. Research ethics boards became standard requirements in Canadian hospitals through the 1960s and 1970s. The consent failures at Weyburn were not replicated in the formal structure of Canadian research after those boards became mandatory. What persisted was the institutional assumption that the most convenient research populations were also the most vulnerable, and that the people whose lives were most constrained by illness, by poverty, by institutionalization, would be most available to research precisely because they were least able to refuse. That assumption is what research ethics infrastructure is designed to counter. The infrastructure is real. It is not uniformly robust. And in the spaces where it is thin, the same logic continues to apply, the same pressure it applied in the observation room corridor in Weyburn in 1954. The window in the door is the constant. The question is always, who is standing on which side of it? The Weyburn Mental Hospital was demolished in 2009. The demolition was a practical decision. The building had been closed to patients since 1971, had served various purposes in the intervening decades, and had become too expensive to maintain and too difficult to repurpose. The demolition was completed in the spring of that year. The site is now partially occupied by a commercial development and partially by a parking area. The provincial psychiatric services that replaced Weyburn are operated through the Regional Health Authority in community-based facilities that are smaller and geographically distributed across the province. Precisely the model that the deinstitutionalization movement had argued for, and that the large institutional model had failed to approximate. The research archives from the Weyburn LSD program are held at the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation, and, in part, at the University of Saskatchewan Special Collections. They are accessible to researchers who submit formal access requests. The session records are there. The grant documentation is there. The observer notes from the corridor side of the observation room door are there, in binders that have been handled by historians and archivists, and, in some cases, by the adult children of patients who received the drug and wanted to know what the record said. No heritage designation marks the site where the hospital stood. No marker identifies the location as historically significant in connection with the LSD research program. The town of Weyburn has a local museum that covers the history of the region and includes material on the hospital's founding and its closure. The research program's ethics failures are not among the museum's permanent interpretive exhibits. The College of Physicians and Surgeons of Saskatchewan has not issued a formal statement on the consent practices of the Weyburn program or their relationship to the professional standards applicable to Saskatchewan physicians. The provincial government of Saskatchewan has not issued a formal apology to survivors. The federal government of Canada, which funded the research and whose internal review identified the consent failures in 1963, has not acknowledged the 1963 review in any public statement. The survivors who are still living are elderly. Some have died. The window for a living acknowledgement, an apology spoken to a person who can hear it, is closing in the way that all such windows close. Not because the obligation diminishes with time, but because the people to whom it is owed do not wait forever. There are two Weyburn mental hospitals in the historical record. The first was built by a province that meant what it said about progressive psychiatric reform, a government that had seen the wards of the existing system and wanted something better, that funded research because it believed research would produce better outcomes, that recruited a psychiatrist from England because it wanted to be at the frontier of something. That Weyburn was not performing. It was genuinely attempting. The second Weyburn was the same institution, operating inside the same building in the same years, running a research program on institutionalized patients who had no meaningful ability to refuse, funded by a provincial government that did not examine its consent procedures, receiving federal grants from a department that would quietly identify the ethical failure in 1963 and quietly continue the funding for 2 years afterward. That Weyburn was not a bad intention. It was a good intention operating in the specific absence of accountability, the specific condition in which good intentions, unchecked, produce the same results as indifference. The two institutions did not exist sequentially. They existed simultaneously, in the same wards, in the same observation room, in the same annual report sent to Regina, describing progressive psychiatric care at a model Saskatchewan institution. The distance between them is the distance between what was claimed and what was done. That distance is not metaphor, it is in the records. Some questions the record leaves open. How many of the 700 patients who received LSD at Weyburn between 1952 and 1961 are still alive? The demographic profile of the patient population at the time of the sessions suggests a diminishing number. No registry of survivors was established. No contact has been made by any government agency attempting to reach them before the window closes. What did the officials who received the 1963 DNHW internal review say to each other in the meetings that produced the decision not to act? The memos from those meetings are not in the documents so far released. The decision not to publish, not to refer, not to stop the funding, a decision that allowed sessions to continue for 2 more years after the federal government had identified the consent failures, happened somewhere. Someone wrote something or said something and chose not to write it down. What was in that conversation? Will there be a formal inquiry? The Saskatchewan government has made no announcement of one. The federal government has made no announcement of one. The political calculation that an inquiry's findings would require an apology, and an apology would imply compensation, and compensation would be expensive, and the people who need the compensation are very old, has not been made publicly. It appears to be producing its effect privately. And what would an apology say? What words, in what order, would accurately describe what the province and the federal government did to 700 people who came to a hospital for help? The observation room window, wire-reinforced glass, 6 inches by 8, set high in the door of a room in the east wing of a building that no longer exists, was an instrument of clinical observation. That is what it was described as. That is what the session notes generated through it were filed under. That is what the federal grant applications called the monitoring procedures it enabled. At the opening of this story, it looked like careful medicine watching its subjects, keeping them safe, documenting, from a responsible distance, what the drug was doing so that the knowledge could be extracted and used to help people. By now you know which side of the door held the notebooks. The building is gone. The glass is gone. The records are in boxes in an archive in Saskatchewan, and the session notes are in them, and the dosage records are in them, and the observer annotations are in them, written in the careful handwriting of people who were watching. Helen Rusk sat in the provincial archives reading room in Regina in 1991 and read the notes that described her from the corridor side of a window she did not know existed. She was 54 years old. She had been waiting 32 years to know what the document said. It said she had been observed. It did not say she had been asked. That is where we are. And the distance between those two things, between being watched and being asked, is the distance that no apology has yet crossed.